Tessa Langford hired a stranger to pose as her fiancé just to stop her own board from stealing her company. Everett Cole, a broke single father about to lose his house, only needed the money, but the second he stepped into the boardroom, the men who had mocked him minutes earlier went dead silent. The chairman's face turned white. The lead attorney's papers hit the floor. The chief financial officer demanded a background check before he even sat down. Tessa assumed they simply feared a man they couldn't control. She had no idea this quiet stranger had already destroyed 3 corporate empires and was about to destroy theirs. Langford Meridian had spent 75 years building airplanes and the technology that kept them flying, and its upcoming anniversary celebration was supposed to be a triumph. Instead, it had become a referendum on whether Tessa Langford deserved to keep running the company her father had built. Word had already spread through the boardroom that Preston Vale, the company's longtime chairman, had quietly secured support from nearly half the directors, and he was telling anyone who would listen that Tessa was too guarded, too unpredictable, and too inexperienced to lead a $9 billion company into its next chapter. Preston had gone further than gossip. He was preparing to announce what he called a strategic alliance between the Vale and Langford families, one that would place a man of his choosing beside Tessa at every public event, while the board quietly took control behind the scenes. When Tessa refused to play along, Preston responded by spreading a rumor that she was secretly involved with a married supplier, a claim with no evidence behind it, but more than enough weight to make several nervous shareholders start asking questions. Jocelyn Hart, who ran communications for Tessa and had spent years cleaning up messes the board created, proposed the only solution she could think of on short notice. Tessa needed to walk into the anniversary gala with a fiancé the public could believe in, someone ordinary enough not to look like another power play, and steady enough to survive being cross-examined by a room full of billionaires. Tessa hated the idea, on principle, certain that hiring a man to play her partner was one leaked document away from destroying what little credibility she had left. Jocelyn reminded her that Preston had already started the war with a lie, and if Tessa did nothing, she would be voted out of the very company that carried her family's name. Across the city, in a modest house on the outskirts of Chicago, Everett Cole received a different kind of ultimatum. The bank informed him that unless he paid $148,000 within 30 days, the house he had shared with his late wife would be seized. Everett had once held a respected position in his field, but he had been quietly blacklisted years earlier, after refusing to alter the findings of a federal investigation. He had spent nearly every dollar he had left, fighting off retaliatory lawsuits meant to bury him professionally, and there was little of his savings remaining. A discreet staffing firm reached out with an unusual offer, asking him to pose as the fiancé of a female chief executive for 30 days, in exchange for $175,000. Everett almost turned it down without a second thought until he saw the name of the company attached to the contract. It was Langford Meridian, and buried in the list of board members were 3 names he recognized immediately: Preston Vale, Meredith Knox, and Graham Pike. They were names that had once belonged to a file he was never allowed to finish. Neither of them entered the arrangement out of ambition. Everett signed the contract because he could not bear to lose the last place that still held his wife's memory, and Tessa hired a stranger because she could not bear to lose the company her father had spent his life building. What neither of them understood yet was that the past each of them was trying to protect belonged to the same enemy. That night before he left his kitchen table, Everett unlocked an old fireproof box and pulled out a file he had kept hidden for over a decade, its cover marked with a single stamped line reading Northbridge Investigation, terminated by executive order. The first meeting took place on the top floor of the Langford Meridian building, in a glass office that overlooked the entire skyline. Tessa deliberately let Everett wait, wanting to see how he handled being kept on someone else's schedule, but when she finally walked in, he wasn't checking his watch or staring at his phone. He was studying the fire exit signs and the way assistants moved files between offices, as if he were mapping the room out of habit rather than boredom. Tessa decided almost instantly that he wasn't right for what she needed, since his suit was clearly years old. His watch was the kind sold at any department store, and there was a gap of nearly 10 years in his professional history that no resume could explain away. She asked him what he actually knew about operating in rooms like this one. Everett answered that boardrooms and interrogation rooms followed the same basic rule that the person talking the most in either place was usually the one hiding something. The answer irritated her, but it also caught her attention in a way she wasn't prepared for. She began firing off scenarios, meant to test him, asking what he would say if a reporter questioned how they met, what he would do if a shareholder demanded old photographs, how he would respond if Preston insulted him to his face, what would happen if one of her exes showed up, and how he would react if the board investigated his finances. Everett answered each one without trying to impress her, and when he pointed out that Jocelyn's proposed backstory was too polished to survive real scrutiny, Tessa realized he understood narrative risk better than her own communications team. He suggested something simpler instead. They had met during a governance consulting session, clashed over a disagreement, and quietly kept in touch afterward, with no manufactured vacations, no staged photographs, and no explanation required for the years Tessa had spent guarding her privacy so fiercely. Tessa agreed to the terms, but Everett laid out 4 conditions of his own before signing anything. He would not lie to investigators or a court under any circumstances. Tessa could not use him to humiliate any employee for entertainment or leverage. No one was permitted to dig into his family's private records, and if he discovered anything that endangered the company, he reserved the right to walk away and report it. Tessa argued that the last condition gave him too much room, and Everett simply told her she was free to hire someone else if she disagreed. She reluctantly signed. During their rehearsal for public appearances, she tried to control every gesture and every glance, but Everett noticed something she hadn't meant to reveal, that her hands clenched whenever she felt betrayed, yet she lifted her chin higher whenever she was actually afraid. He told her that a real partner would notice things like that, and when she asked if he had experience pretending to be someone's fiancé, he said no, but he had plenty of experience standing beside someone the whole room wanted to destroy. Before their session ended, Tessa asked him to try on the engagement ring meant for their public debut, and instead of admiring the size of the diamond, Everett turned it over and studied the maker's mark etched inside the band. He recognized it immediately as belonging to a jewelry subsidiary under Meridian Holdings, a shell company that had once surfaced in the Northbridge file more than a decade earlier. He said nothing to Tessa about what he had noticed. As he was leaving, she handed him the guest list for the anniversary gala, and he skimmed it briefly before speaking, telling her that 3 people on that list were going to try to take her company away from her. When she asked how he could possibly know that, he answered simply that 12 years earlier they had done the exact same thing to somebody else. The anniversary gala was held at the most prestigious hotel in Chicago, drawing more than 600 investors, executives, and journalists into one glittering ballroom. Tessa arrived with Everett's arm beneath her hand, and from the outside, they looked like exactly what the room expected. A formidable couple, built for headlines. On the inside, Tessa was counting every step and quietly reminding him to stay on script while Everett was doing something else entirely, watching the room the way a man watches for exits. When reporters swarmed them almost immediately, he let Tessa answer the bulk of their questions, only stepping in with small natural details whenever she stumbled over a timeline, redirecting attention without ever making her look unprepared. Russell Dane, who represented an independent block of shareholders, studied Everett from a distance and noted that he didn't move like a man who had been hired to stand in front of cameras. He moved like a man who was still cataloging every exit in the building. Graham Pike approached next, openly mocking Everett's outdated suit and asking what a man with no title had done to deserve standing beside a chief executive. Everett didn't raise his voice. He simply glanced at Graham's cufflinks and mentioned almost casually that the symbol on them belonged to Northbridge Systems, a company that had dissolved more than a decade earlier. Graham's smile disappeared in an instant, and he excused himself without finishing his drink. Preston Vale arrived moments later, and the second he saw Everett's face, he stopped mid-sentence in front of several guests. Everett extended his hand politely and said it had been a long time, and Tessa immediately turned to watch her chairman's reaction. Preston denied ever meeting him before, but his hand trembled slightly as they shook. Meredith Knox recognized Everett only seconds after that, and she dropped the glass she had been holding, quickly signaling her attorney to check the guest list against something else entirely. Within minutes, the entire tone of the room had shifted, and the same executives who had planned to embarrass Everett now avoided him completely. Preston ordered security to quietly verify his background, while Meredith placed a discreet call to a former federal contact to ask whether an old file had ever truly been unsealed. Tessa noticed every bit of it, but Everett refused to explain what was happening. During his prepared remarks, Preston intended to publicly question Tessa's leadership in front of every shareholder in the room, and Everett spotted the draft resting beside the podium before it began. He warned Tessa quietly that Preston was about to attack her credibility in front of the entire company. Rather than retreat, Tessa walked onto the stage before Preston could finish his introduction, and she presented Everett as her fiancé, and the person who had helped her imagine a future beyond the arrangements the board kept trying to force. On air, the crowd applauded warmly, and Preston had no choice but to smile through gritted teeth. Once the speeches ended, he pulled Everett into a private room and asked bluntly how much money it would take for him to walk away from Tessa. Everett answered that 12 years earlier Preston had asked him that exact same question. Preston warned him that the Northbridge file had been closed permanently, and that nobody cared about the truth anymore. Everett told him calmly that Preston clearly still cared because that fear was written all over his face. Outside in the hallway, Tessa happened to overhear the end of that conversation, and for the first time she understood that Everett was not a stranger who had wandered into her crisis by accident. He had already fought these same people once before, and they had not defeated him fairly. The next morning, Tessa asked Jocelyn to quietly look into Everett's background, hoping to understand what had unsettled the board so badly. What came back was an almost entirely redacted file, page after page of black bars, where a career should have been. The only line left untouched read simply, "Everett Cole, lead examiner, 3 corporate boards dissolved." Tessa confronted him directly in her office, furious that he had hidden his history, while demanding her trust in return. Everett reminded her that the contract only required him to play the role of her fiancé, not to disclose sealed federal records to a woman he had known for a matter of weeks. When she asked what exactly he had done to dissolve 3 separate boards of directors, he finally gave her a real answer. He had once led a small team responsible for uncovering fraud inside corporations that held federal contracts, and his job was never to threaten or arrest anyone, only to find the exact point where the numbers stopped being able to lie. Over the years, he had uncovered a bribery network buried inside a transportation company, a pension fund, quietly using retirement savings to hide massive losses, and an aviation supplier, selling equipment that had never passed proper safety inspection. Every one of those investigations ended the same way, with an entire board of directors forced out. Northbridge had been his 4th case, and the only one he was never allowed to finish. He discovered that Preston, Meredith, and Graham were all connected to a network of shell corporations, but before he could submit his final report, his superiors ordered the file sealed and had him reassigned somewhere. It wouldn't matter. Rather than sign a falsified conclusion, Everett resigned from his position entirely. Tessa asked why he had never gone public with what he knew. Everett explained that the documents legally belonged to the federal government, and releasing them without authorization would turn him into the criminal, while the people who were actually guilty painted themselves as victims. While they talked, the board had already begun quietly working to destroy him. Graham leaked details of Everett's mounting debt and the string of companies that had refused to hire him, while Meredith sent Tessa a report suggesting Everett might be using their engagement to steal confidential trade secrets. Preston called an emergency meeting to determine whether Everett represented a genuine security risk to the company. During that meeting, Graham read Everett's financial troubles aloud in front of every director, mocking a man on the verge of losing his home while standing beside a billionaire chief executive. Tessa waited for Everett to defend himself, but instead he asked Graham a single question, wondering why his personal credit report had been paid for using a corporate account belonging to Langford Meridian. The room went completely silent. Everett had already noticed the transaction code buried at the bottom of the file, and using company funds to investigate someone's private life without authorization was a direct violation of internal policy. Meredith tried to dismiss it as an administrative error, but Everett pointed out that the payment had been routed through a consulting firm called Halberd Risk Partners, registered at the exact same address as a vendor once connected to the Northbridge case. Tessa immediately demanded an internal audit of the transaction. Preston objected loudly, but Russell Dane backed her instead, and the board was forced to approve a preliminary review. After the meeting, Tessa asked Everett whether he had taken the job specifically to investigate them, and he admitted honestly that he had only needed the money at first. But once he recognized old patterns resurfacing, he could no longer pretend not to notice. Tessa warned him that his job was to protect their engagement story, not to rescue her company. Everett answered quietly that perhaps by now the two had become the same thing. That night, Tessa began to feel ashamed for having judged him based on nothing more than an outdated suit and a foreclosure notice, while Everett saw in her a leader capable of repairing what her father had left behind, if only she could stop protecting herself with cold distance from everyone around. Here, the preliminary audit soon uncovered something far worse than either of them expected. Langford Meridian had paid Halberd Risk Partners more than $48 million over 6 years, and the final approval on every one of those invoices carried the signature of Tessa's father. The signature on the most recent documents was dated 2 full years after his death. Tessa was shaken in a way she hadn't expected. She had always believed that whatever the board tried to take from her, they would at least respect the memory of the man who founded the company, and discovering that someone had forged her dead father's signature to steal money made the entire fight feel personal in a way it never had before. Everett advised her against reacting publicly, warning that if Meredith realized they had found the forgery, she would erase whatever evidence remained. Together they agreed to investigate quietly and strictly within the boundaries of the law. Tessa granted Everett temporary access as an advisor to the office of the chief executive, though he never handled the raw data himself. Instead, he guided an independent auditing team toward the exact patterns worth examining, and what they found was a network designed to move money through layers of vendors before quietly funneling it back in the form of consulting fees, false investment returns. It was in almost every detail a smaller copy of the exact scheme Northbridge had once used. Through all of it, Tessa and Everett still had to maintain the illusion of an engaged couple in front of the public. At a dinner with major shareholders, Tessa tried to keep everything within the boundaries of their rehearsed story, until Russell Dane asked without warning what exactly had made Everett fall for her. Everett didn't reach for the answer they had prepared. He said that Tessa walked into a room as though she needed no one, yet she was always the last person to leave, staying behind to make sure her employees never had to absorb the consequences of someone else's mistakes. Tessa knew it wasn't entirely a lie, and later that night she asked him how long he had actually been paying attention to her that closely. He told her it had started the moment she refused to let the board fire her assistant just to cover up their own failure. Tessa hadn't realized he had noticed a moment so small. Slowly, she began telling him about the pressure of being expected to become the perfect successor to her father, and her fear that if she failed, everyone would say he had been wrong to trust his company to his daughter. Everett told her about raising his daughter alone after losing his wife, learning to grieve while still showing up for every responsibility that came with being a parent. His daughter was grown now and living her own life, far from the story unfolding around them, but the old house still felt like the one place his family hadn't completely disappeared. Tessa finally understood why he had taken this job in the first place. She offered to pay him the full amount immediately so he could save the house, even if he chose to walk away from the contract early. But Everett refused, unwilling to let gratitude turn into another kind of debt between them. Around the same time, Preston pulled Everett aside privately and offered him $5 million to disappear from Tessa's life, hand over everything he had uncovered, and sign a permanent agreement of silence. Everett asked why a fake fiancé would possibly be worth $5 million to get rid of. Preston lost his composure and accused Everett of having ruined countless lives in the past. Everett answered that all he had ever done was write the truth into a report, and it was their own actions that had ruined those lives, not his. When threats failed to work, Preston revealed that a fund connected to the board had just purchased Everett's mortgage outright, warning that if he continued digging, the house would be seized immediately. Everett walked away without giving him an answer. Tessa learned about the private meeting afterward and briefly wondered if Everett had taken the money, and the old suspicion crept back in between them. Everett said nothing about the threat against his home, unwilling to let her use the company's resources to fix what he considered a private problem. During a charity event, soon after, the two of them were expected to dance in front of cameras as part of the performance, but as the music slowed, Tessa realized she had stopped paying attention to the reporters surrounding them entirely. Everett told her she didn't need to control every single movement. She answered that giving up control was exactly how people ended up betrayed. He told her that wasn't quite true, that it was trusting the wrong person that led to betrayal, not trust itself. The very next morning, the internal audit team discovered that Everett's credentials had been used to access the company's servers at 13 minutes past 2 in the morning, and thousands of confidential files had allegedly been copied under his login. Meredith presented what looked like airtight evidence during an emergency session of the board. Everett's account had accessed the servers. Overnight security footage showed a man in a jacket matching his walking into a restricted area. A storage device had turned up inside his own car, and a portion of the stolen data had somehow appeared on his personal computer. Graham demanded that Tessa terminate the contract immediately and report Everett to the authorities, while Preston pretended to be devastated, claiming he had warned Tessa all along about bringing a man with financial troubles into the company. Tessa asked Everett directly if he had an explanation. He said he had been at home during the exact window the breach occurred, but he had no witness to confirm it, and he quickly realized the stolen data had been planted in his car, while the security footage conveniently only captured him from behind. Tessa wanted desperately to believe him, but the evidence in front of her seemed too complete to dismiss. Everett studied the access log more closely and noticed that every document had been digitally signed at 17 minutes past 4 in the morning, despite the alleged copying process having ended at 46 minutes past 3. He told Tessa not to focus on the man they were pointing at, but on the clock they had forgotten to fix. Preston ordered security to escort Everett out of the building immediately. Tessa was left with an impossible choice: to publicly defend Everett and risk being seen as blinded by emotion to suspend him and keep some control over the investigation herself, or to hand the entire matter over to the board and let Everett take the fall completely. She chose to suspend his access and asked him to leave the premises, uncertain whether it was a strategic decision or an outright betrayal on her part. Everett didn't know either. His expression turned cold as he removed the fake engagement ring and placed it on the table between them. Before walking out, he told her she didn't have to trust him, but she should never trust evidence handed to her by someone who controlled the entire system it came from. News of the investigation leaked to reporters almost immediately, and headlines quickly labeled Everett a con man who had seduced a chief executive to steal corporate secrets. Details of the fake engagement contract also began leaking, though nothing yet carried Tessa's signature. Preston offered to save her reputation if she publicly declared that Everett had deceived her from the beginning. Tessa refused. Instead, she quietly asked Jocelyn to check the timestamps on the digital signatures again, and together they discovered that the security system used 2 different time zones after a recent software upgrade. The documents marked 17 minutes past 4 had actually been created before Everett's account had ever logged in at all, proving the entire trail had been prepared in advance. When Tessa reviewed the security footage a second time, she noticed the man in the jacket walked with a completely different gait than Everett, and that the jacket itself had been pulled from the guest coat room. The serial number on the storage device found in his car matched a batch purchased directly by the finance department. Every strand of evidence, once examined closely, led back toward Meredith instead. Meanwhile, Everett returned home to find an eviction notice already taped to his front door, proof that the board had followed through on their threat. He could have used Tessa's payment to delay the foreclosure, but his accounts had already been frozen because of the ongoing investigation. Preston called him one final time, offering to have the house restored if Everett would sign a written confession. Everett refused outright. Preston told him he had already lost his career chasing the truth, and now he was about to lose his home the same way. Everett answered simply that the truth still hadn't disappeared, no matter how hard Preston tried to bury it. Everett believed Tessa had chosen power over him, while Tessa began to understand that her failure to defend him openly had hurt him far more deeply than any insult the board had thrown his way. She was starting to realize that a relationship built on a contract had somehow become real in ways she could no longer control. When Tessa finally traced the final access record, she discovered that the security badge used to plant the device in Everett's car belonged to Meredith's personal assistant. Before she could act on what she had found, Preston called an emergency vote to remove her as chief executive the following morning. Preston leaked the fake engagement contract to the press before the vote could even begin. Public opinion turned against Tessa almost overnight, with investors accusing her of manipulating her own image to influence the outcome of a corporate election, and the company's stock dropped sharply the moment the market opened. The board called an emergency session attended by shareholders, attorneys, and reporters from every major outlet. Preston offered Tessa a way out, telling her to resign quietly, place all the blame on Everett, and the board would agree not to pursue legal action against her for misleading shareholders. Tessa recognized the offer for what it truly was. The moment she stepped down, Preston would gain full control over the servers, the audit records, and every piece of evidence connected to Halberd Risk Partners. Jocelyn urged her to keep pretending to cooperate until they had gathered enough proof to fight back properly, but Tessa refused to sacrifice Everett a second time just to buy herself more room to maneuver. Instead, she walked up to the podium in front of every shareholder in the room. Tessa openly admitted that the engagement had started as a business arrangement, refusing to shift blame onto Everett or make excuses for her own decision. She told the room she had made that choice out of fear that the board would take her company away from her, and that the man hired to lie for her had turned out to be the only person willing to tell her the truth. She stated plainly that Everett had never stolen a single file, and that he had been deliberately framed after uncovering illegal payments hidden inside the company's books. Preston interrupted, demanding proof. Tessa laid it all out: the mismatched digital timestamps, the serial number tied to the finance department, the record of a coat pulled from the guest room, the security badge belonging to Meredith's assistant, and the forged signature attached to the Halberd invoices. Meredith dismissed the entire presentation as the desperate theory of a chief executive with nothing left to lose. Tessa admitted the evidence wasn't yet enough to prove the full scope of the network, but it was more than enough to demand an independent investigation. Russell Dane began to openly question the board's motives for the first time, though Preston still held enough votes to remove Tessa if the meeting proceeded as planned. Outside the building, Everett watched the session unfold on a television screen, listening as Tessa defended him publicly, even knowing it could cost her everything she had left. It was the moment he finally understood that she hadn't suspended him because she believed the board. She had done it to buy time she desperately needed. Jocelyn arrived at Everett's house shortly after carrying a document Tessa had just discovered buried in her father's private archive. It was a letter written 12 years earlier that had never been sent. In it, Tessa's father explained that he had secretly been cooperating with a federal investigator to expose the Northbridge network, intending to hand over the remaining evidence once he had secured the company against Preston's growing influence. The investigator's name written in that letter was Everett Cole. Everett suddenly remembered that Tessa's father had once served as a confidential source in the very investigation he had lost. When the case was sealed, Everett had assumed the man had simply abandoned him. He now understood that Tessa's father had been isolated and blocked by the same people, unable to finish what he started before his death. The letter contained an access code to an offline archive the board had never known existed. Everett and Jocelyn located a drive stored inside a private safe belonging to the Langford Family Trust, and inside it was the original Northbridge ledger, along with far more recent transactions tied directly to Langford Meridian. The real total wasn't $48 million at all. Over 12 years, the board had funneled a staggering $480 million out of the company. Everett didn't return because of the contract anymore. He returned because Tessa had chosen the truth, even while believing he might never forgive her for suspending him. Before walking into the decisive meeting, he called his old federal contact and read out the code to a file that had been sealed for over a decade. The voice on the other end told him his authority to investigate had just been reinstated. The vote to remove Tessa as chief executive was already underway when the doors to the boardroom opened. Preston believed he had already won, holding enough proxy votes to secure the outcome, and he had a statement prepared, naming himself interim chief executive the moment the ballot closed. Everett walked in wearing the same worn suit Graham had once mocked, except this time he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a representative from the federal agency overseeing corporate contract fraud, an independent auditor nominated by Russell Dane, an attorney representing the independent shareholder bloc, and two forensic financial investigators. Preston immediately ordered security to remove him from the building. The federal representative announced that Everett was no longer present as Tessa's fiancé, but as a reinstated special investigator on the Northbridge Langford case. Russell asked point-blank who Everett actually was. The representative explained that Everett had designed something called the Gray Ledger Protocol, a method for tracing payments between parent companies, vendors, and investment funds in order to expose assets being quietly recycled through a system. That single method had already dismantled 3 separate corrupt boards of directors. Everett's name had never appeared publicly since most of his work remained classified, but among executives who had once been investigated, he was known as the man who could scan a report thousands of pages long and find the single transaction capable of collapsing the entire structure behind a place. That reputation was exactly why the board had panicked the moment they saw him at the gala. It was never about his wealth, and it was never about his relationship with Tessa. They were afraid of him because they recognized he would eventually see the same fraud pattern they had copied directly from Northbridge. Everett laid out the original ledger recovered from Tessa's father, connecting each piece of evidence without wasting time on speeches. Halberd Risk Partners had received payments directly from Langford Meridian, then funneled that money through 3 consulting firms with no actual employees, which in turn invested in a fund controlled by Preston's relatives. That fund had quietly bought up personal debt belonging to several board members, used part of the stolen money to purchase voting shares from smaller shareholders, relied on Meredith to approve transactions using a dead man's forged signature, allowed Graham to hide operating costs behind fake vendors, and ultimately gave Preston the resources to build an alliance meant to remove Tessa entirely. Meredith accused Everett of building his case on stolen documents. Everett produced written confirmation that the archive belonged to the Langford Family Trust, not the company itself, and that Tessa's father had personally granted access to federal investigators before his death. Preston tried to shift the blame onto Meredith alone. Meredith immediately produced emails, proving Preston had personally approved the structure of the fund, and Graham insisted he had only ever signed what he was told to sign. Within minutes, whatever loyalty had held, the 3 of them together completely collapsed. Russell Dane called for an immediate halt to the vote against Tessa, replacing it with a new motion to suspend every board member connected to Halberd. Preston still believed he had enough voting power to survive the challenge. Everett informed the room that the shares Preston had purchased using stolen funds had already been frozen by court order before the meeting even began, meaning every proxy vote tied to them was now worthless. For the first time in the entire meeting, Preston had nothing left to say. Furious, Preston demanded to know if Everett had planned this from the very first day he walked into the company. Everett answered that he had come to play the role of a man in love with her, and it was the board itself that had reminded him exactly who he used to be. The new vote began almost immediately, and one by one the independent board members raised their hands to suspend Preston, Meredith, and Graham. The final vote belonged to Tessa, and she looked directly at Preston as she cast it, telling him plainly that this had never been his company to take. Preston, Meredith, and Graham were suspended on the spot, their access to company systems, accounts, and voting rights cut off immediately. Federal authorities chose not to make an arrest inside the boardroom, purely for spectacle, opting instead to issue formal summonses and asset preservation orders, a decision that carried more real consequence than any dramatic scene ever could. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their real estate transactions came under review. Their ability to use company stock as collateral was suspended. Their passports were flagged for monitoring, and any communication with employees now had to pass through legal counsel first. Meredith quickly offered to cooperate in exchange for leniency, handing over emails that proved Preston had directed the scheme from its earliest stages. Graham in turn tried to shift blame back onto Meredith. Preston was left watching the very people who had once served him turn against each other in a matter of hours. Early estimates from investigators suggested that most of the $480 million could eventually be recovered, and Russell Dane agreed to support Tessa in the vote for chief executive on the condition that she completely restructure how the company governed itself. Tessa presented her plan without hesitation. She would dissolve every committee Preston had personally created, rotate in independent auditors on a fixed schedule, publicly disclose all transactions involving related parties, establish a protected channel for employees to report misconduct, give employee representatives real oversight authority, place strict limits on how long any chairman could serve, and claw back bonuses from every executive found responsible for the fraud. Shareholders voted overwhelmingly to keep her in place as chief executive. After the meeting ended, Tessa found Everett in the hallway preparing to leave, now that his contract had officially run its course. She apologized for never explaining her plan when she suspended him, and Everett admitted he had hidden too much of his own past and tried to carry every risk alone instead of trusting her with it. Tessa held out the fake engagement ring, reminding him that the press was still waiting for them to finish the story they had started. Everett asked how much longer she intended to keep lying. Tessa told him simply that she didn't want to lie anymore. They stepped out together to face the reporters waiting outside. Tessa confirmed that the engagement had begun as a business arrangement, but insisted clearly that Everett had never been the con man the headlines described. Everett said that hiring him had been Tessa's mistake, but she had corrected it by choosing the truth over her own reputation. When a reporter asked if there was anything real between them, Tessa hesitated, reaching for a carefully diplomatic answer. But Everett spoke before she could. He said that was a question they didn't owe an answer to anyone but themselves, at least not yet. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Tessa smiled without thinking about how it would look. Not long after she learned that Everett was still on the verge of losing his house, since the fraudulent mortgage purchase would take months to unwind through the courts, she offered to pay off the debt herself immediately. Everett refused to accept it as a gift. Instead, the legal team proved that the purchase of his loan had been financed entirely with stolen money, allowing the transaction to be reversed and the original mortgage terms restored through the courts rather than through charity. Everett kept his house because the law demanded it, not because anyone had taken pity on him, and that distinction mattered to him more than any amount of money ever could. Preston was eventually charged with fraud, embezzlement, obstruction of a federal investigation, and falsifying corporate records. Meredith became a cooperating witness, though she still lost her position, her assets, and her professional license in the process. Graham pleaded guilty to charges connected to the falsified vendor invoices and was permanently barred from holding an executive role at any publicly traded company. Every board member connected to the scheme was ordered to return the bonuses they had collected while the fraud was ongoing. A few weeks later, Tessa offered Everett a permanent position as the company's chief integrity officer. He looked over the contract for a long moment before speaking, telling her that he had already worked for her once under a false name, and this time he needed to know exactly why she wanted him to stay. Tessa didn't answer him with a grand declaration right away. She told him that Langford Meridian needed someone who wasn't afraid of the board, someone who couldn't be bought, and someone who would never mistake loyalty for blind obedience. But she also admitted that wasn't the only reason she wanted him to remain. Everett had seen her at her weakest moment, learned about her greatest mistakes, and never once used any of it to control her. Nobody else in her life had ever done that. Everett accepted the role of chief integrity officer, but only under 3 conditions of his own. He would report directly to both the chief executive and an independent shareholder committee. No single executive would ever be allowed to block an internal investigation again, and any employee who reported wrongdoing would be protected from retaliation. Tessa agreed to every condition without hesitation. 6 months passed, and Langford Meridian recovered the majority of the money that had been stolen, and while its market value slowly climbed back, something more important had shifted inside the company itself. Employees no longer needed permission from a supervisor to report misconduct. Every contract tied to a shell company had been terminated, and executive bonuses were now tied directly to safety, transparency, and long-term stability rather than short-term numbers. Everett never turned into the kind of executive who chased attention. He kept wearing the same simple suits, made his own coffee every morning, and often sat with the newest members of the audit team instead of retreating to a private office. The people who had once dismissed him quickly understood that his calm demeanor had never come from a lack of ambition. It came from the simple fact that he no longer needed their approval to know his own worth. Outside of work, his relationship with Tessa developed slowly and quietly, without contracts, publicity schedules, or rehearsed gestures of any kind. They began having dinner together after long days, taking walks with no cameras following them, and arguing occasionally over things that mattered without either of them needing to win. Tessa visited the house. Everett had almost lost seeing the old photographs, the kitchen he had repaired more times than he could count, and every quiet trace of a life he had fought hard to protect. She realized the house wasn't proof that he couldn't move forward. It was a reminder that real love doesn't become meaningless just because someone is gone. Everett in turn noticed that Tessa was no longer running the company simply to prove her father had made the right choice. She had begun leading it according to her own values, instead of the shadow of someone else's legacy. 1 year after that first anniversary gala, Langford Meridian held another celebration in the very same hotel ballroom, and this time Preston, Meredith, and Graham were nowhere in the room. Russell Dane had become interim chairman of a fully independent board, and Jocelyn ran the event, while joking that she would never again arrange a fake engagement for anyone as long as she worked there. During her speech, Tessa didn't talk about defeating the board or reclaiming her seat. She spoke instead about the responsibility a leader carries when they discover the system they inherited had been quietly corrupted from within. She thanked the person who had forced her to understand that honesty wasn't only about telling the truth when it was convenient, but about being willing to lose power rather than become the very thing she was fighting against. After the event, Everett brought Tessa back to the small private room where Preston had once offered him $5 million to disappear from her life. She asked why they had returned to that particular room. Everett pulled out the fake engagement ring from all those months earlier, the one he had quietly bought back after it was returned to the jewelry company that made it. He told her that ring had once represented a lie, a transaction, and the fear of losing everything. Then he set it down on the table without using it to propose at all. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a much simpler ring, nothing like the enormous diamond her communications team had originally selected, but one he had personally chosen and had made himself. Everett told her that the first time she had paid him to stand beside her while the whole room turned against her, and this time he wanted to choose that position for himself. Tessa asked if this was somehow part of another investigation. Everett answered that this was the one decision in his life he never needed to double-check against any set of records. He asked her for real this time to marry him. Tessa didn't answer with words right away. She took the old fake ring out of its box, set it gently aside, and offered him her hand instead. She told him there would be no contract this time, no deadline, and no way out. Everett slid the real ring onto her finger and she said yes. The next morning, several newer members of the board walked into a meeting and fell quiet the instant they saw Everett seated beside Tessa. One young director quietly asked Russell why people still seemed cautious around Everett, even though the old board had been gone for nearly a year. Russell watched Everett calmly turning the pages of a financial report and answered that honest people never had any reason to fear him. Tessa overheard the comment and glanced at the man once hired to play a fake fiancé now wearing a very real ring on his hand. Everett looked up and asked if she was ready to begin the meeting. Tessa smiled and said that now she finally was. Power that silences other people has never been as frightening as truth that a corrupt system can no longer suppress. Everett didn't win because he had more money than the board, a higher title, or some miraculous secret weapon. He won because he understood that every dishonest system eventually leaves a trail behind it. Tessa didn't save her company because she never made mistakes. She saved it because when the moment came to choose, she placed the truth above her own reputation and above her own power. What began as a fraudulent contract only became something real once neither of them needed to perform a role for the other ever again.